Recording in progress.
Welcome to the City Council special meeting this Monday evening, April 15th. I now call this meeting to order. Deputy Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Hedges.
Here.
Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Councilmember Lorraine.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Newsom. Here. Mayor Diaz-Nash.
Here. We are excited to be here in person with options for those who choose not to be in person to participate virtually. There are several ways to participate. For those attending in person, please complete a yellow request to speak slip and hand it to the deputy clerk. If participating remotely, use the raise your hand feature in Zoom and you will be called on at the appropriate time. If calling in via phone, please press *9 to raise your hand, and when called upon, press *6 to unmute. These options for public comment will remain available until I close the public comment period for each specific item. We will begin the special meeting by convening into closed session. Item number 1, conference with legal counsel, existing litigation, workers' compensation. Deputy City Clerk, before we convene to closed session, do we have any requests to speak on this item?
Through the mayor, we have no request to speak on this item.
All right, thank you. Well, then we will convene into closed session and return when we're finished. for shampoo and conditioner in your office? Oh, okay.
I don't know, does it cover up?
No, it doesn't do that, unfortunately. From closed session. And our next item will be draft local roadway safety plan presented to us by Bethany Lopez, senior engineer. Thank you so much.
Good evening, Council. My name is Bethany Lopez, Senior Engineer overseeing traffic in the Public Works Department. Online, we have our project manager for this, for the local roadway safety plan from our consultant team, Anusha Musunuru. She's here to answer technical questions regarding the plan, and so we can ask her if we have any at the end of it. All right, so moving into it, the questions we're going to be asking Council specifically is, how should the following types of proposed systemic treatments be prioritized for implementation? We are going to go through what systemic treatments are and describe these further. We do want to note that we are not seeking feedback from Council on any of the specific improvements at particular locations, which will come before Council at a later date. Rather, we're seeking Council direction on how to prioritize these types of improvements really against each other, and we'll discuss each type, as I mentioned later in the presentation. And then for the agenda, we're going to go over what a local roadway safety plan is, talk about this plan versus a lot of our other plans, talk about how the plan was developed and some of the components of it, implementation and monitoring, and then get into some of the next steps. So to talk about the framework for how safety improvements are proposed, this is really the high-level concept around transportation safety, which is really a concept that's identified and adopted at the state and federal level, and that's called the Safe Systems Approach. And really the top concept, what you see there at the top of the circle, is that death and serious injury on our roadways is unacceptable. And the rest of this safe systems approach really works to incorporate elements that feed into that top concept, that we're looking to eliminate fatal and severe injury collisions on our roadways. And in order to make that happen, some of the main components that we're incorporating is redundancies in our transportation network, and identifying that roadway users make mistakes and building our roadway network as such, so that way when mistakes are made, it doesn't result in fatal and severe injury collisions. So as we'll discuss in the LRSP in this document, these are really going to focus, the improvements that we're making recommendations for are really going to focus on infrastructure types of improvements. And while we do have some more strategy, programmatic types of improvements, I'll talk about where a more robust version of those would get developed. So as we're looking at this wheel, the safe roads components and the safe speeds components are really what we're going to be focusing on with the local roadway safety plan. And so what is the plan? The plan utilizes crash data, and it uses it to identify patterns and trends. We use that data along with feedback from the community because we understand that the crash data that we have is really an incomplete picture of what's going on our roadway network. And so we wanted to collect a substantial amount of community feedback to be able to understand other challenges that our community members are having that may not be represented in the data, or to confirm that our data was accurately representing the challenges that the community sees as well. And so by adopting our local roadway safety plan, it meets requirements for the city to have a safety plan, and it allows us to qualify for safety-related project funds or grant funds, such as the Safe Streets for All Fund or the Highway Safety Improvement Grant Fund, which are both federal funds. They provide big dollars, and those are types of grant funds that we want to be able to go for. So as I dive into what a local roadway safety plan is versus other plans, really it all starts with the general plan. The general plan is the top, right? You guys just adopted the general plan. And within the general plan 2040, we have the circulation element, and right at the top of the circulation element is goal C-1. And what we identify in goal C-1 is to design and implement a multimodal transportation network. This network prioritizes walking, bicycling, and transit use. It is sustainable, safe, and accessible for all users. And really that safety component is the one that we're going to be focusing on in this document. It connects the community using all modes of transportation, and it reduces vehicle miles traveled per capita. And so from that, our plans go, we have a variety of different plans, as you may be familiar with, and they really start at the very high level, and they go into very detailed types of recommendations. So as I mentioned, it starts with the general plan, and that's where we define the need for walking, biking, transit use. But it also defines other elements such as vehicle use, truck use, as well as some of the green infrastructure components that we have in there. And then we also have various plans, like I said, at different levels of specificity to support each one of these roadway users. So we have our pedestrian master plan, our bike master plan, various other plans for transit agencies that we work with. We have plans for our vehicle network, which incorporates our traffic impact analysis guidelines, or things like our traffic calming policy, truck route plans, green infrastructure plans. And so we identified a handful of years ago that our plans have some competing priorities, and that's where we identified the need for our San Mateo Complete Streets Plan, which is in the works. A more specific version of this is for the North Central Plan, which aligns very similarly, but is more for a specific neighborhood. And so what the Complete Streets Plan will do is identify it's really an in-between between our general plan and our more specific modal priority or modal plans. And it provides overarching guidance about where the different modal priorities are, especially if there's competing interests or competing priorities for those, and makes recommendations for how to implement those different modes on our roadways, knowing and understanding that we have limited right-of-way to implement such things. All right, and then from there we have more specific plans, like our TOD pedestrian access plan that gets into even greater level of detail that addresses how pedestrians access transit. So that's a pedestrian and transit specific plan. We have another plan that gets even more detailed, and this is really right before we get into the project level design, which is an example, our Fashion Island Boulevard Smart Corridor and Mobility Hub planning effort. And so we may not call this a plan per se at this point, but it's really a planning effort before we get into the design. And this is combining elements from our bike and our transit and our vehicle networks and trying to align how they're implemented on this one corridor. So for the local roadway safety plan that we're talking about tonight, it really sits alongside a lot of our other modal plans. It encompasses elements from all of these plans in that it looks at the data related to all of these plans, a little bit less specifically for the green infrastructure plan, but definitely with all of our different travel modes on our roadways. And where our other plans utilize a lot of community input and feedback to determine where we want specific types of improvements, our local roadway safety plan is required to be data-driven. We have to utilize collision data in order to make recommendations for where we're seeing the greatest amount of collisions and where we're identifying collision trends. And we're going to talk about that tonight. And then also there's this discussion about a Vision Zero action plan. And so a Vision Zero action plan differs a little bit from a local roadway safety plan. As I mentioned, our LRSP is going to be primarily infrastructure based, whereas a Vision Zero action plan, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in detail, but it starts to incorporate higher level policies and programs. And so that's where you can see it sort of shifting up back towards the higher level element. It sits side by side with the complete streets plan, and it works hand in hand with it. And so getting into that a little bit more, as I mentioned, the LRSP would focus on infrastructure improvements. Again, we do work towards that same goal of reducing fatal and severe injury collisions. However, generally the LRSP sits within Public Works, but we did receive input, as I'll talk about, from other groups, our safety partners, as well as the community, whereas a Vision Zero action plan really establishes a set specific date to achieve this goal by. And what that means is that we need to work with our regional partners along with a lot of our departments to make strategic decisions about how we want to achieve this goal. So this is a modification in the way that we do business in working towards achieving goals of reducing fatal and severe collisions. We do incorporate elements of the LRSP, the infrastructure components of it, as well as elements of the complete streets plans. It also includes demographic specific actions. And so while we did do a lot of this analysis, we don't have demographic specific recommendations. And so that's something that the Vision Zero action plan would do. And then there's regular meeting of these different groups to work towards identifying that goal. And so again, our document that we're going over tonight is the local roadway safety plan, and were there to be a desire, as we have seen in our general plan, which was adopted, that we would need to take these additional steps to do so. So getting into the plan development, and before doing so, I wanted to just acknowledge this, the safety partners that we had in this. This is also referred to as our project development team. We worked with Fire and PD, our Senior Citizens Committee. We reached out to the Center for Independence of Individuals with Disabilities. And we also worked with San Mateo County Office of Education and San Mateo County Health. And we incorporated their feedback into the plan. And they were helpful in us developing the plan. All right, so getting into the plan framework. So we're going to go into two different types of projects that were identified as part of the plan. So we had site-specific projects, and these projects were identified based on collision history and road data at individual locations to identify and prioritize improvements, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And those site-specific projects recommended improvements were made for these locations based on best practices. And so this is one of the things that you'll see throughout the plan is that the recommendations for improvements at these locations are prescriptive, and they're intentionally done so that we can qualify for the grant funding funds that we want to pursue. So this is a requirement that the state and the federal government made for the grant funds that we want to seek, that the types of trends that we're seeing have to have prescribed what they call countermeasures or improvements, and these are really proven safety strategies to address the types of trends that we're seeing. However, we did also incorporate community feedback in these. So for the types of collision trends that we're seeing, or collision challenges that we're seeing, there may have been a handful of different types of recommendations that we could have made, and we utilized the community feedback to really hone in on the kinds that we wanted to see in our community. For the systemic treatments, this really looks more towards collision trends, and it also incorporated community feedback, and very similarly, it utilized best practices along with that community feedback to make recommendations for the treatments, and then all of these will work together in implementation. So for the site-specific improvements, again, these are top collision data, or top collision locations, and this is based on a weighting methodology defined by the Highway Safety Manual. I'll have to get back to you about what AASHTO refers to or what the definition is, but it's a general design guidance. It's a nationwide design guidance that's utilized for various roadway design elements. And all of that collision data is mapped, and then from there, utilizing that weighting, we were able to identify our top 10 priority locations. So starting with our signalized intersections, we have Poplar Humboldt, Fashion Island, and Norfolk, Hillsdale, Franklin, which is actually the same intersection as the southbound off-ramp, southbound 101 off-ramp, Peninsula and Delaware in the north, Hillsdale and Norfolk, and then El Camino and 27th Avenue. Our unsignalized intersections were El Camino and 22nd, Humboldt and Indian, and Humboldt and Tilton. And then our corridor, our primary corridor, our only corridor to make the top 10 list was the Hillsdale Boulevard corridor from Saratoga to Norfolk. And so just to talk really quickly about what kind of improvements we're making for these, again, based on community feedback and the prescribed types of measures that come from the federal and the state government. We're going to take the Poplar-Humboldt intersection as an example. So what's happening right now is that our pedestrians have a walk signal at the same time that our vehicles making northbound lefts also have a green, we call it a green ball. And so they're allowed to make their turn, called a permissive movement, when the coast is clear, sort of thing, when there's no conflicting movements. Well, what's happening is that when our pedestrians are going and when our vehicles are going, we're finding that this is the greatest type of collision that's occurring at this intersection. So a countermeasure or an improvement that we're going to be looking to make is to separate these. So we can modify the signal in such a way that the vehicles are not allowed to make a left turn at the same time that the pedestrians are going. And then similarly, the pedestrians won't be allowed to go when the vehicles are allowed to make their left turn. So we separate them using signal timing. And so this is actually a project that we are in the process of designing and will go out to bid this summer. All right, so getting into the systemic treatments, these are collision trends and our community data points, or our community data just generally, our community outreach. So, and again, when we talk about systemic treatments, these are treatments that we can make at a broad number of locations based on locations, those locations really just having similar types of characteristics. And so this is really the epitome of being proactive and making our improvements at different locations. And we get this question a lot. Do you need to wait for a collision to happen before you do something? And this is really the approach to say, no, we don't want to do that. And we're going to use data to make the recommendations for where we want to make those improvements. So before diving into the actual treatments, we're going to talk about the collision trends that we're seeing. So starting with the crash frequency by year, so we looked at our collisions in a number of different ways. Looking at it over time is a common one. And you can see here that we mapped out our collision data, which was 2017 through 2021. And you can see that generally our time during COVID, our 2020 and 2021 years, we saw a decrease in the overall number of collisions. And it's hard to see at the very top, there's little slivers of fatal collisions, and then the blue there is the severe injury collisions. One of the reasons why we have a desire to continue to focus on our fatal and severe injury collisions is because we understand while generally we want to reduce all collisions to the extent possible, we're finding that even in years where we had a decrease in the overall number of collisions, we actually had an increase in the number of fatal and severe collisions. And so it's a reason for us to continue to focus on those. And then we get into different modes versus severity. And what we identified in the data is that of all of the collision data that we looked at, 3.4% of them resulted in crashes, resulted in collisions that had at least one death or severe injury collision. And when you look at these images side by side, or I guess top and bottom, what we're saying or what we're showing here is that overall the number of collisions that we had, the number of bike and ped collisions represented about 15%, 14% of our data of the overall number of collisions. But when we look at the number of collisions by fatal and severe injury, we see that those bikes and pedestrians represent over 50%. So they're well overrepresented in the fatal and severe injury collision realm as we look at it by type. And then, again, looking at this, these are different types of collisions. So you may be familiar, so side swipes are just two vehicles coming up to the side of each other. Rear end we're familiar with. A broadside is, we know it as a T-bone collision. Hit object, I think the rest of them are intuitive. So what we see is that 66% of the total collisions are comprised of the top three. However, again, when we look at the fatal and severe collision types, the bikes and vehicles, vehicle ped and broadside collisions comprise 71%. So again, there's an overrepresentation in these other types, such that solely looking at where we have the most collisions isn't really lending to where we have the most challenging types of collisions. And then we also looked at San Mateo data compared to statewide data. So in the statewide data, the state has this strategic highway safety plan, and they identify 16 challenge areas, and this is intended to be used for comparison purposes. And one of the things first that we found was that our city has an overrepresentation in the number of intersection collisions, bicyclist collisions, and pedestrian collisions, where we are over 2 times the average of the state types of collisions. And so these are aligned with really what we're seeing in our data, and a suggestion that we need to really focus on these types of collisions. And other areas for us to focus on are aggressive driving, young drivers, aging drivers, and distracted driving. And so while these ones really are more in alignment with the state challenge areas, they still lend a focus for items that we need to focus on. And then getting into the community input, we held 2 pop-up events at the College of San Mateo Farmers Market and the Central Park 4th of July event. We developed a city webpage, and we used similar data as the posters that are shown on the top left in this image to solicit feedback on our online survey. We also posted about 100 posters around the city, which were focused in the downtown and North Central and Hillsdale. And these included neighborhood-specific information and was also a way for us to solicit feedback from the community. So with that, we received over 1,000 views on our project webpage. We had over 500 scans from our posters and flyers. We distributed about 100 business cards, and these business cards had QR codes on them that lent to our project webpage. We had over 500 unique comments on our interactive map, and we had just under 700 visitors to our story map. And again, that was our citywide data that we posted online. And this is what we heard. We heard that there were concerns with intersections, red light running, speeding, pedestrians and bicyclists, and school zones. And we wanted to see how this information correlated with our collision trend data that we found. And so using this information, we made recommendations for systemic treatments. And so speed management is really the broadest systemic treatment that we have in the plan, and really a whole presentation could be spent on talking about speed management. It's a pretty complex conversation or discussion about how to appropriately manage speeds, but really its implementation comes in a variety of forms, and it's really context sensitive, meaning that what may be appropriate for one road may not be appropriate for the next road over. And it's included because it's a really great reference for a lot of the grant funding pursuits that we want to make, specifically for quick build projects, which are a type of project that we're allowed to pursue with the Safe Streets for All grant funding. And so looking into this a little bit, one of the primary ways, or some of the primary ways that we want to look to address speeds are through appropriate speed limits, setting appropriate speed limits, and designing the roads for the speeds that we want. So first, this first one setting speed limits that we want. It's a prescribed process, but recent changes in the law have allowed us to identify lowered speed limits. And so this is something that we're already looking at doing, is to essentially identify the lowest possible speed limits that we can adopt for our roadways that are legally defensible. The second is about designing our roadways for the speeds that we want, and that really lends back to a lot of the work and effort that's happening in our Complete Streets plan. Another effort or another recommendation is for leading pedestrian intervals. This is a way to address pedestrian safety at signalized intersections. And what it does is it provides a head start for pedestrians when vehicles still have a red light. This is something that's already implemented in our downtown area. And so you can see that there's recommendations for LPI in our downtown. So that it does already exist, but the document formalizes that recommendation. And there's other locations in the city where that's recommended. Signal visibility improvements is another one that was recommended, and this would address, or the idea is that this would address broadside collisions by making the signals more visible, with the suggestion that perhaps the reason that people are running the light is because they can't see the signal, and so this is a methodology to help with that. No right turn on red treatments is kind of a big one. So this eliminates or restricts right turns from happening when there's a red light. So typically we're allowed to yield or stop and then proceed after yielding the right-of-way. So this would completely restrict that ability to make turns on red, but again, this is a way to enhance our pedestrian safety at intersections. There's various types of implementations, like you can see in the photo, the no right on red signs alone, or there's examples on the bottom here of what are called blank out signs, and so these just become more visible when they're applicable. And I think we are still looking at the appropriate locations for where to implement this, and there's a variety of ways to implement it. So it can be at just certain types of days or specific locations based on their characteristics. And then centerline hardening, you can see an image of this at the top. And really what this is doing is reducing speeds of our turns and increasing visibility for our turning vehicles of folks that are in the crosswalks. And so this is a relatively straightforward implementation. It does not have to happen at our signalized intersections. It can happen at all intersections, really, and a relatively straightforward way to enhance pedestrian safety. All right, so just doing a really quick summary of these, of the various, the 5 treatment types. You can see here that they address a variety of different issues. They have a variety of different costs. And the timelines to implement them, certainly our speed management is one of our longer term efforts, and it's something that we anticipate we're going to be taking or utilizing implementing for a long time. And we're also showing how challenging this will be to implement and how it aligns with the community input that we received. So with one of the lowest cost implementations, shortest term and difficulty to implement being our leading pedestrian intervals, we think that this is going to be a really straightforward implementation. All right, moving into implementation and monitoring, we did want to identify for funding that we actually do already have 2 projects that are identified. 2 of our site-specific projects are already identified in our CAP program. One of those, as I mentioned, is the Poplar Humboldt signal modifications. The other is the Norfolk Fashion Island Boulevard signal modifications. And these are projects, the Poplar Humboldt signal is a little bit further along than the Norfolk signal. There's some projects that are either already completed or already included in other efforts, such as some of the Peninsula Avenue intersection improvements that are proposed that would go along with our bike facilities that are proposed there. Peninsula Avenue Hillsdale Boulevard improvements. There's some that are forthcoming as proposed through some of the Caltrans efforts. And then LPI, like I mentioned, was installed about 10 years ago in the downtown area, and so this would be expanding on that. And then for any of these projects that we have recommended, site-specific or systemic, they would qualify for grant funding, like I mentioned, and there's a large amount of different grant funds available for these, but 2 of the main ones to discuss are the Safe Streets for All and Highway Safety Improvement Program. And then for monitoring and updating the the plan, the recommendation is to review crash data annually and modify our approach to our implementations and to revisit this every 3 to 5 years with the understanding that our crash trends may change, our site-specific or our priority locations may change over time, especially as we work towards making these implementations, and continue to work with our safety partners on that effort. So next steps for this would be to adopt the LRSP in the spring or summer of this year, continue the projects that we're already working on in our CIP program, work towards identifying grant funding for the identified projects in here, and to request additional CIP funding based on these identified priorities. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, the question for council is, how should the proposed systemic treatments be prioritized for implementation? And just for reference, this is the table that was discussed briefly, going over those for your review. That's it.
Thank you very much, Bethany. I know this is something everybody in San Mateo is very, very interested in. So it's time to move to public comment. And I'd like to open it up. Do we have any questions for public comment?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. If you wish to speak on this item and you are attending via Zoom, please raise your hand now. I'll give you a few moments to do so. Madam Mayor, we have no request to speak on this item.
All right, then I will close public comment and bring it back to the council for any questions and comments. Councilmember Lorraine.
Thank you, through the mayor. Thank you, Bethany, for your presentation. I'll start with questions. Momentarily. I did have a question about the vision that's presented in the local roadway safety plan, because I think when I read it, I wonder if there might be an opportunity to make it more descriptive. I think I was a bit more inspired by the graph that you shared in your presentation of the safe systems approach. And I wonder if you thought there would be any issue with having the vision language maybe mirror more of the safe system approach.
I don't think there's any issue with adding any level of specificity to the vision statement.
Thank you. I appreciate you answering some of my questions earlier. I guess I do have another question about the systemic safety improvements that we're reviewing and prioritizing tonight. Given that bicyclists, some of the data that you shared with us about bicyclists and pedestrians being disproportionately impacted by some of the collisions we're seeing in our city, do you think that that there might be room for any other systemic safety improvements that might be more targeted to specifically reducing risk for bicyclists?
So I think it's a good question, and I do think that, as I mentioned in the email, I think that our speed management recommendation is really one of the biggest things to work towards bike safety. Generally, we have an incomplete bike network, and that's causing some of the challenges that we have for connectivity for our bicyclists. And so I think that the speed management component and working towards implementation of the Complete Streets Plan, as I mentioned, will help complete that bike network, provide access for bicyclists. And as we're doing so, we're looking at the appropriate types of treatments to utilize, particularly at intersections. And so we are looking at the safe systems, looking at the LRSP for how to make those recommendations, including things like bike signals and looking proactively at things like the no turns on red where it makes sense, or where there may be conflicts with bike signals. And so as much as I'm not suggesting that we don't need to look at other ones, I think that speed management recommendation is really going to be the primary one to help us get there.
I appreciate that. And I'm just curious if maybe you wouldn't mind sharing a little more or explaining what the bicycle signal heads in particular are and how they might help.
Sorry, say that one more time.
I was curious about, in particular, the bicycle signal heads treatment, because I guess I haven't seen too many myself yet, and so I guess if it wouldn't be too indulgent, I was curious to learn like a little more about how if that sort of treatment might help reduce risk and how they even function.
Yeah, certainly. So I think generally one of the greatest places, as we saw in the data, that we're seeing challenges is at intersections. And so how we plan for our bicyclists to interact at our intersections is one of the biggest things that we're going to be looking towards. And so as we look at bike signals, one of the challenging movements at an intersection is a conflict with right turns. And so, for instance, we're looking at this on our Delaware Safe Routes to School corridor improvements, which is implementing a Class 4 facility. And in that, we're looking at how we may separate our right-turning vehicles from our bikes, and allowing our bikes to have a green bike signal while we're giving our right turners a red signal, and then allowing for our right turns to then have a green signal while our bikes have a red signal. So similarly to the pedestrian separation from the left turns, we would be, that I showed in the presentation, we would be doing something similar for right turns and bicyclists to establish that separation through the signal, through signalizing that.
I see. Excellent. No, that's helpful. I appreciate that. I did notice that at the moment, our mission statement indicates a target date of 2050 for I guess effectively Vision Zero, in that where we eliminate fatal and severe accident-causing collisions in our city, but I get the sense that other cities, perhaps in the Bay Area, are setting targets sooner than that. And indeed, one of the documents from which we're, referencing the MTC document for the Bay Area indicates an aspirational, perhaps, target of 2030. Could you maybe explain a little how we arrived at 2050 in this document, and whether there might be opportunities to seek a date before then?
Yeah, certainly. So referencing the MTC policy, as I mentioned in the email, one of the things that they are suggesting in their policy is that they're committing to working with agencies to implement safety improvements that work towards Vision Zero. So they are not committing to the act of eliminating the fatal and severe collisions, so it's a little bit nuanced, where that responsibility really lies with the agencies, with local agencies themselves, to implement these types of improvements. And so their strategy is to do what they can in the policy level and the funding level side of things to help push the needle towards safety, if you will. And they're committing to do that by 2030, and I think with their goal of eliminating fatal and severe injuries by that time. But I think, again, the implementation really lies with the local agencies. And so for us, I think that we have an opportunity to potentially look at a sooner date, and as I had mentioned in the email, that that were we to move towards development of a Vision Zero action plan, that's really the appropriate time to determine what that appropriate date is, that we would be willing to commit both project funds and the department level effort that's needed to get towards a more specific target date. But certainly something sooner than 2050, I think, is something that could be achieved.
Thank you. Mayor, those are my questions. I have some comments I'd like to share, but I could defer until others get the opportunity to ask questions.
Okay.
Unless you'd prefer something different.
No, I think that's fine. So who would like to go next?
I'll go. Thank you. And great questions and excellent presentation, Bethany. Thank you so much. I was hoping you could shed some light on the new laws that have changed that give us some more purview and control around speed limits. I know that that's been a constraint for us for a long time, and so this is good news. And if you could just elaborate on that change and how that impacts the city and gives us more liberty.
Yeah, certainly. There's been a handful of different laws. I think one of the earlier ones was the law that allowed the city or allowed agencies to adopt a 15-mile-per-hour speed limit around schools. So that's one that we're currently in the process of implementing. We're already in construction for that, and that will be complete before the summer is over. So that's one that, like I said, we're already taking advantage of. There's a few other ones, and I'm trying to remember the specifics of all of them right now, but really what a lot of them do is, as I mentioned, the idea around setting speed limits is very prescribed, and what it does is allow for additional flexibility in certain circumstances. So, for instance, some of those are in areas defined as business activity districts, and so this is areas like our downtown area where we have businesses really fronting the road. We have zero lot line setbacks. So, in those kinds of areas, we're allowed to, again, if we meet the criteria that is described in the law, we can make recommendations for lowered speed limits, and they also have allowed for speed limits to be set lower than 25 miles per hour. So that's another change that came into play just a handful of years ago, where previously the lowest speed limit that could be legally established was 25 on all roadways except for things like alleys. We're now allowed to set lower speed limits, 15 and 20 miles per hour, where different criteria apply. Another effort that this will be pertaining to, this being the local roadway safety plan, is utilization of lowered speed limits again on our high injury network or places where we have a high concentration of bikes and peds. And so again, this information that we've identified here in the plan will help us identify what those corridors are. There's a limitation to how many corridors we can identify. I believe there's a identification that we can only identify 5% of our overall roadway network as these high collision or high concentration of ped corridors to utilize this lowered speed limit. And so again, that's something that we're going to need to take a look at very carefully. They are intentional about not wanting this to be a really widespread arbitrary lowering due to speed trap laws that California has.
Thank you. And that's great news. It sort of dovetails into my next question, which is, we've been talking about the forthcoming downtown area plan, and so, the presentation did a wonderful job illustrating how all of our plans are talking to each other and related, and I just am wondering, how, as we move forward with other types of area-specific plans, how, where do those efforts fit into, into all of those plans and specifically this plan? And I know that there's quite a lot of interest in implementing some of the safety measures that have been, outlined here in this presentation and the plan. So I'm curious how, when we have another forthcoming plan about to start, that, with new pedestrian malls, and I'm thinking back to COVID when we had safe streets and slow streets, and, there's always something that's going to come up. So how do we keep this plan fresh and relevant as we continue to plan for more things?
Yeah, certainly. So similar with the Complete Streets Plan, this plan did coordinate with the efforts that are currently going on with the Complete Streets Plan, and they utilized the data that was identified in this plan for recommendations in that plan. So there is very intentional overlap and coordination that's happening between our plans, and I would anticipate that something similar happens with any of our future plans. And then to answer the sort of second question is, how do you keep this plan relevant or fresh? Again, I was mentioning at the end of the presentation that this is the first of our local roadway safety plans. This is not going to be the last. We are going to continue to have collision data, unfortunately, and we're going to need to utilize that to make recommendations for updated improvements. And so that's how I would anticipate. And so doing so, I anticipate that, again, this data will be folded into any future plans that we have.
Okay, and then my last question is, as we continue to be data-driven and look at our collisions more with with high levels of scrutiny, Are there ways or mechanisms, or potentially can this council be empowered to drill down even further to look at collision data, based on sort of demographics? So there's a lot of information about collisions that happen with new drivers and then senior drivers. And I'm thinking about sort of sometimes like the programmatic relationships with, for example, the Get Around program, which provides subsidized senior rides, and our forthcoming silver tsunami, and our aging community, and how our risk factors and the conditions for driving will change because of our population changing. And so I'm curious to hear, like, are there ways for us to further analyze our collision data on a demographic level to the extent that it would be valuable to the conversation and further inform some of the programmatic fixes?
Yeah, absolutely. And then going back to what I was mentioning about development of a Vision Zero action plan, that's really where a lot of that lies. We would be working with not only our police and fire department internally, as well as the city manager's office, but we would be working with external partners, including like the Get Around program or SamTrans or San Mateo County Health, to identify programs and policies that we would want to implement that utilizes that demographic information to make specific and targeted recommendations for. So it does get into that level of detail because we need that level of detail, because not everything is an infrastructure-based improvement. Safety can't only be achieved through the infrastructure that we want to look to implement. That's a component of it, certainly, and it's an expensive and large component of it, but definitely programmatic, targeted improvements or policies are things that would be incorporated with the Vision Zero action plan.
That's very encouraging. And, and I raised this because we recently, just last week, had a collision where one of our seniors, instead of accelerating, she reversed into one of our local businesses and went straight through the window. And if that had happened at a different hour, there would have been an entire class of students lined up to get into that cheer class, and that could have been catastrophic. And I think I myself am not the best of drivers, and have had my share of bonks. If you see my car anytime soon, so I say this, because we want to provide support to our all of our drivers, and especially our drivers that want to, are seeking support and seeking subsidized rides to that are, that this city, so wonderfully provides. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Hedges, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. I was going to let Rob go, but if you want me to go now, I will. Go ahead, Richard. By the way, this was
Put your mic.
I always think my voice carries better than it does. This is an excellent report. I can tell how hard you've worked on it, as well as the staff. And it brought up some great issues. One of the questions I'm more of a nuts and bolts person, so I'm going to ask you some questions about, and just let you know that I've actually been hit in an intersection by an automobile at the corner of, right near the gas station on Delaware in front of the old police station. And the reason I'm telling you this is that the sun had a lot to do with it. Low levels of sun and people accelerating to make the turn and not seeing me. Have you ever thought, because I can see some places that work here in San Mateo, about having scrambles? And let me tell you why I said that. Scrambles cut down 50% of the time that a pedestrian is in an intersection. And they also do away with right-hand turns on red lights.
Yeah, so we are currently considering a handful of scrambles, and a scramble is a fun way of discussing an exclusive pedestrian phase. So what that means is at an intersection, a signalized intersection, that a pedestrian gets their walk signal and all vehicle movements have a red signal. So it's really, again, exclusively for pedestrians to make that crossing. So yes, we are contemplating them at a handful of locations. They are included, or they are going to be installed at either end of the pedestrian mall on B Street already. So that's something that we analyzed, and we're
Sorry,
going to
which intersection?
at B and First and B and Third.
That was going to be one of my recommendations. Okay, so I would look at B and Cemetery Drive too. We've had a number of automobile and pedestrian collisions downtown over the years. The other place I would recommend, not now, but in the future, would be Concar in Delaware when we're built out there, and with Caltrain running more often. It just seems to make perfect sense to me. I've been talking about this when Larry Patterson was head of, and he said maybe someday. So, have you given any thought to 17th and El Camino?
Yes?
We've had deaths there. That's one of those unprotected pedestrian on the left turn. And I know of at least 2 deaths at that intersection. So I kind of cut you off. So what have you considered at that intersection?
Yeah, we haven't done an in-depth analysis of that location. It is actually a corridor that's included in our complete streets plan. It's also an intersection that's included in our TOD pedestrian access plan. So we have recommendations made for that intersection in those various other plans. It's not one of the locations that rose to the top in our top collision locations in this plan. It's not to say that it's not a challenging intersection. It's just to say that it's not one of our top locations in this plan. But
Now, would Caltrain be able to veto anything we're doing there since it goes onto a state highway?
sorry, can you repeat the question?
Caltrain is in control pretty much.
Yes.
Yeah, so would they be able to veto anything we try to do there, do you think?
I think that they are the owner-operator of the intersection, so certainly we're going to need to get their buy-off for anything that's proposed there. But they also have recommendations and guidelines to to prioritize bike and ped access and address collisions similarly to how we at the local level are doing so. And actually, they just in February released a document to implement LPI, the leading pedestrian intervals that we talked about at all Caltrans intersections that meet specific criteria, which is pretty far-reaching. But we would anticipate working with them. So similarly, we're doing work at 28th and El Camino, right by the Hillsdale Caltrain station, and we're going to be making recommendations for that signal, and we anticipate having to work with Caltrans to make improvements that are beneficial to our bike and ped community.
Okay, that's good. Oh, speed. Whatever we can do to lower speed. I was really encouraged by your report on lowering speeds. I'm good in some areas with speed cameras. It doesn't bother me at all. I've been here 54 years and never had moving violation in California.
Well, some people are special.
No, some people drive very slowly. So on turns on red lights, that came out of the Carter administration to save fuel during the gas crisis. It had nothing to do with safety, and we should be viewing it through a safety lens instead of a fuel-saving lens. If I could wave a magic wand, I'd make it everywhere. It's not going to fly, but we need to pick intersections, as you're doing, I think, where that can be done very effectively. And it may be a good idea, not only the scrambles downtown, but also no right-hand turns downtown. The streets are crowded with pedestrians and they're narrow. I think it's, my opinion would be a good idea. I'm going to listen to everybody else, and I'm going to keep this high. This report is so good, just really high on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Bethany, you did a great job of capturing how all the plans come together, and really appreciate it. I don't have very many questions, just a few. I was I very rarely drive downtown, but with the weather, I was actually in my car driving through downtown, and I thought it seemed slower but safer over the weekend when it was raining. And I was wondering, do we have any data yet to kind of demonstrate how, if the lights are working or helping us with collisions?
Are you referring to just the traffic signals, or?
Well, yeah, the stage, the staging of the pedestrian crossing being separate from, the left turn and right turn lights.
Yeah, we haven't actually implemented, if you're referring to the exclusive pedestrian, the PED scramble, we haven't implemented that just yet.
No, but we do have it now so that.
Oh, the LPI, my apologies, the leading
Sorry, I
pedestrian
couldn't
intervals.
think of the acronym,
yes.
but yeah.
No, we don't have data that we have collected about how effective our LPI signals are. It's something that has, and just anecdotally, it's something that's requested based on people seeing it in the downtown at a number of other locations, and so we're excited to see it in the plan being recommended more broadly because we do have requests for it. At the federal level, this is a systemic treatment that's recommended, and they identify that there's a 13% or so decrease, thankfully, in pedestrian and vehicle collisions where LPIs are implemented at intersections, at signalized intersections. Okay. So we do anticipate that there will be safety benefits.
Yeah, it anecdotally seems like there already is improvement, but I was wondering if we'd had information. I interact with the school districts as the liaison for the city, and I think literally probably almost every call, one of the things they talk about a lot is concerns with students crossing the El Camino Real and the train tracks. Specifically, students are crossing to go to Burrell, Bowditch, Aragon, and Hillsdale high schools, and they live like on the east side, and they're crossing over the west side and vice versa every day. And I didn't really see in what's kind of highlighted out that we addressed that. I don't know if it's because that's a different plan or if it's because the El Camino Real is a state as opposed to a city, but if possible, I'd like to see something put into this that says, look, we're aware of the issues and we're trying to identify 3 or 4 safe crossings, every mile or 2 miles as you go down the El Camino Real. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
And
there are recommendations for El Camino. We didn't remove it because it's a Caltrans facility, so there are recommendations for El Camino in there.
Okay.
But more broadly, El Camino Real is discussed in our Complete Streets plan.
Yeah, I thought it might be a different plan. Okay. And then the only other question, which was just, we do have some train strikes, unfortunately. Does that get considered as a collision, or is that a separate category?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have the answer to that. I would guess that it's considered a collision as well, okay. But certainly not one that rose to the top in the data that we saw.
Thankfully, good. Okay, that was all I had. Thank you so much.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you as well from me. Following up on Deputy Mayor's question about schools, how would you prioritize if one of the objectives was to increase safety around schools with traffic? How would you prioritize these initiatives?
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a good question. I think one of the biggest things that we're seeing is the need for speed management. It's at the top for a reason. The Safe Systems approach makes a recommendation to reduce kinetic energy. And what that means is to reduce speeds, because we see that the speed is correlated with the severity of the collision. So if you reduce the speed, even though we certainly don't want the collision to happen in the first place, if it were to happen, it's less likely to result in a fatal and severe collision. And so in our speed management recommendation in the plan, there are specific corridors, and these are major corridors. These are not just our neighborhood streets that we would implement typical traffic calming types of measures on. And again, looking at that slide, we would be making broader implementations for those roadways that are appropriate for the context, including their being adjacent to schools and having school children crossing them.
Okay, great, because it might be the most difficult and the most costly, but it's foundational. How would quick builds sort of cover all this, or how would you prioritize based on that?
So I think, as I mentioned, one of the main reasons why we included speed management, even though it's one of the more challenging ones to implement, is that we can qualify for quick build funds from the Safe Streets for All grant fund. So that's something that I think would be worth looking into. But as the slide shows, there are certain things that are shorter term in their implementation and just generally more easy to implement. And so they have their own, effectiveness. And so things like the LPI are relatively inexpensive, primarily staff time to implement. And this is something that's as easy as pushing a few buttons on our traffic signal computers or controllers at the intersections. Signal visibility enhancements, they're a little bit more difficult to implement, but again, their effectiveness is there and it's a relatively straightforward project. So as far as quick build, these would fall under that lens of not requiring a substantial amount of background design effort and being able to get it on the ground more quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. And has the data that you've collected recently, does it show substantial change from the data that was like back in 2020 or whenever the last major collection happened?
Yes, I don't have this offhand. I'm not going to ask the chief to come up here for that, but I believe that we had achieved no fatalities this past year. I don't know if
Right.
you happen to remember that. So yes, I think generally we are trending in the right direction, thankfully. I don't have that data in front of me, but generally I think we are trending positively, meaning better, not more.
Great, yes. I was going to say, we have one small mini Vision Zero achievement, which is a big one. And I think that's fine for right now, for the questions. So thank you. So I think we need to give Bethany our recommendations on these 5 treatment types and how we would prioritize them. So who would like to start? Councilmember Lorraine.
Thank you, through the mayor. So I think I'll just mention that, of course, all of these are important and we should be doing them all. So I'm not sure how impactful this prioritization ought to be. But that said, I think my thinking at this moment is that, of course, we should be taking advantage of the short-term affordable projects. Lead pedestrian interval and no right on red stand out to me as kind of number one in my mind because they're on the more affordable side. They have an opportunity to bring some impact. They address pedestrian issues. They address turning issues that have been described in our data. And there's good public visibility on them. I feel like, especially no right on red, will help remind people that we're working on this and we prioritize safety in our city. As Deputy Mayor Newsom mentioned, LPI is downtown already, and I agree with him that I feel, at least anecdotally, it's helping. And it certainly feels safer to me, and I think it does to others as well. I'll also appreciate Councilmember Lee's comments about the downtown area plan update. And so I guess insofar as, I imagine any LPI and no right on red that gets increased and potentially implemented should be guided to some extent by the downtown area plan update for maximum efficacy. I like centerline hardening. I think that's one of the types of quick build projects that residents have been coming to us asking for more of. The Bay Meadows treatment stands out in my mind. It's not exactly a centerline hardening, I admit, but I think projects like those are ones that I hope we can, through this plan and process, begin to prioritize more and see more of. Similarly, good public visibility. Then I guess I would put signal visibility enhancements. And I feel like speed management ends up last on my list because of the cost and the timeline and the difficulty. But I think there's a way to maybe break it up. We've talked, I think through the presentation and the discussion tonight to date, there are some lower hanging fruit maybe within this as well that I hope we can try to prioritize and bring in with the short-term more affordable work that we're considering. As Bethany mentioned, we're already working on reducing speeds in near our school areas. I appreciate the discussion Councilwoman Lee brought up with Bethany about next steps that could happen in our downtown. So let's definitely do that. And quick build work could help here too, I feel. I guess that's where the Bay Meadows pilot kind of comes in to me. Like there's a potential to consider some of what in a complete streets plan would be expensive, medium term, difficult to implement, but maybe there's an opportunity to try stuff first with temporary fixtures, maybe not doing the whole thing, but doing something. So those are my comments on that. And I guess I'll just try to quickly throw in some other quick comments. I would recommend revising a little bit of the language, and I can probably share a note offline about related to the vision and mission statement. I think these can be more inspiring, and I don't think it'll be difficult to do. I do think I found the graphic from the federal guidance inspiring this safe system approach, and so I'm guessing something that just fleshes that out a little more will be helpful. And this is, as Councilmember Hedges mentioned, a lot of good, helpful, and important work that we need to be doing. So I am very thankful. I think it speaks to many concerns we've heard from residents calling out some of the more serious collisions that we've experienced on our roadways recently. And the numbers show that cyclists and pedestrians are disproportionately involved in collisions with fatalities and serious injuries. They're getting hit more and hurt more in our city than the state average. So we need to be addressing this. And it's great for staff, council, and the public to be seeing the data that, along with community information, drives our efforts to implement things such as bike lanes and traffic calming in our city, with safety and access for all as key priorities. I appreciate the work of a diversity of partners in local government, San Mateo Police Department, SMC Fire, County Health, and more, along with Public Works, of course. And I look forward to future work with more partners in a Vision Zero action plan that will help us more finely focus on ways we can create a systemic culture of multimodal transportation safety in our city with a target date sooner than 2050. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Hedges.
Yes. First of all, I got to thank Adam. I mean, he rides his bike everywhere. He understands. He knows where the safety issues are and should be listened to. So I think I have to agree with Adam that the leading pedestrian intervals and the no right turn should be number one. I am going to disagree, even though it's more difficult. Speed kills. I would like to put speed way high on the list. And there may be some ways we can deal with it. Every time, even though I'm not speeding, I get informed by my iPhone that there's an enforcement issue down the road. We may be able to work with some of the folks to let them know that there's a real effort to prosecute speeders in San Mateo. And would you put that back up, please? I want to make sure I state everything right. Thank you. Plus, nobody wants to look at me. So I don't understand the center line hardening quite as well as Adam does, but I think that's very important. And signal visibility is very important. One of the things I'm concerned about with that, and it's concerned me since we started doing it, when we put the high visibility, like downtown pedestrian crossings, I mean, I was in meetings with people not long ago that didn't even know that every intersection is a pedestrian crossing. Right here in this building 3 weeks ago, and people that are in the know in the city too. And so I'm just concerned that it takes the drivers understanding away about how important all crosswalks are. But I think if we're going to go for for signal visibility, it should be everywhere. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Lee.
Well, thank you to my colleagues. I think that I'm largely in agreement with what Councilmember Lorraine said in terms of his prioritization, and I would agree with Councilmember Hedges about the prioritization of speed. But I think that that could also be accomplished by segmenting and phasing that approach. So we are actually slating it in and treating it as a #1 priority, but in very specific, discrete places where it's warranted. And so, I think that, for the reasons that Councilmember Lorraine stated, it, leading with the low-cost, immediate fixes that that can save lives in the most acute kinds of collisions that are vehicle and pedestrian involved, that should be our #1 priority if we're looking at the hierarchy of need and protecting life first. Right, so that's where I think we get the most impact from a safety perspective, and for that reason, I would strongly agree with what Councilmember Lorraine said in his reasoning. But I also, I'm not sure if the request is like you want us to rank in, #1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay.
You're saying you're matching Lorraine's.
I would say I match Councilmember Lorraine with the caveat that we're including speed management in the most acute areas. Got it. Okay, then those are my comments. I would agree with Councilmember Lorraine's comment about the framework of our system safety approach, or safe systems approach, is that was such a beautiful articulation of the vision, and so I think that makes a lot of sense to make that again explicit in the vision, and absolutely, I hope that our council shares a common goal of being much more ambitious of achieving Vision Zero well before 2050, right? So I look forward to drilling down on a date, hopefully closer to 2030. I'll just tip my hat to that one. Okay, that's what I have.
Deputy Mayor.
Sure. I'll try to keep this brief. I concur with everything that's been said. I would start with the leading pedestrian interval, which is the shortest term, lowest cost. I would go signal visibility, no right on red, treatment, and centerline hardening next as the costs go up. And then, obviously the only concern with speed management to me, the biggest one, is around the school's corridor safety. So I would like to see, like Councilmember Lee suggested, that would be the one caveat that I would want to see that bumped up particularly in school zones. And I know that there are some things, and some of this goes into centerline hardening, for example, where we could do road diets, bulb outs, bumps, slapsticks, I call them. I don't know if that's what but that's my term for them. But, we could definitely do a lot more of that. It would be great if the police could do more, even if it's not necessarily enforcement, but more police presence, especially in the morning hours, and just kind of have a motorcycle officer rotate school campuses once every morning for, half hour, an hour. Just having them there, I've witnessed this at Aragon last month, just having them there immediately puts people on notice, where and then it sticks with them, so it shouldn't have to be like that. And the reality is, you don't even have to issue a ticket almost. It's just having police officers there and having people go, oh gosh, I better slow down. I'm texting and driving and I've got kids everywhere. So those are my concerns and thoughts with that. Also, obviously, I agree with everyone in that 2050 is too far out. I'd love to see 2030 or 2035, but something much sooner than that. And I think that's everything. So thank you.
All right.
Great work.
Let me just finish up. I agree that speed around schools, for me, that's #1. And everything that my fellow council members have said, and so much of it is perception, right? It says, because so many of the people that are zooming through are actually parents who are late to work, and so it's a community effort. But all the suggestions Deputy Mayor had, I think, are great. As well, Councilmember Lorraine is probably our cyclist on the council. I think I'm probably the walker on the council. And so I really have appreciated the leading pedestrian intervals, and I've personally experienced improvements. I know that's, qualitative research, but I would put that number 2, no right on red in certain areas, number 3, centerline hardening, number 4, and signal visibility enhancements, number 5. But I also think in terms of communicating, while yes, we want Vision Zero before 2050, we achieved Vision Zero for no fatalities in 2023. And I think we need to go out and broadcast it and let people know, say, we can do this. This is not a off in the clouds. This is, we are starting to do it right now. Let's maintain it. So communication, education is important. So thank you very much. Did you get what you needed from us?
I believe so. So what I have is that the low-cost, quick, kind of the quickest version to implement is kind of the priority with looking at the school near schools, the speed management, and ultimately, you know, over time, the speed management piece is going to be critical. But it's going to cost us a little bit more money.
But speed management at schools. higher.
First, I see that.
Yeah.
Yes. I hear you.
I was going to say, well, we're already doing the speed management around school, so we've committed to that. I think the net new would be around downtown.
But there still continues to be, I'd love to see more investigation, certainly posting 15, but whether it's police presence or whatever, there continues to be
Just
an
overall.
issue. So just
Yeah,
managing
no,
it.
we'll note that. But I think I have the level of hierarchy from,
Okay.
you know, the spirit of the council.
I do have one question.
Councilmember Hedges has a
How many
question.
motorcycle officers do we have at current?
Chief, is it 6? My guess.
That strikes the
And
fear
then
of God
Chief,
into the speeders.
Chief, can you also talk about the work that we're doing with the schools as well?
Sure. Good evening, council, or mayor and council members. We currently have 6 motorcycle positions. They work 40 hours a week, so we have 3 to 5 a day. We are at schools every morning and every afternoon. We do that on a rotational basis. The challenge is for every school that we're at, there are several that we're not. So we try to use a rotational basis to make sure that we have a presence at all schools. And your second question, City Manager? I'm sorry?
Was the number of officers and how we manage our morning and our afternoon routine?
Sure, we
of
have
patrolling?
four motorcycle officers that work a Monday through Friday schedule. And we have one motorcycle officer assigned to each patrol team, which splits the week in half. So anytime during the week, we'll have between 3 and 5 motorcycle officers out there, and then on Saturday and Sunday, it'll be 1 or 2.
Can I ask a quick question, Chief? Do we do any decoy vehicles right now? Like where we put a vehicle like a block from a school with no...
Yeah, there are some positives and negatives to that. People generally catch on to that pretty quick, and it also
Sure.
provides a kind of a false sense
of security.
So we
Okay.
want to be careful about doing that.
All right, thanks.
Thank you very much. All right, Bethany, thank you again so much. And we are done, and why don't we take a break so that everyone can set up and visit other things. Thank you all very much.